Welcome to the R Street panel, an RTO for the West. What's in it for consumers? This has been a question debated for nearly as long as power markets have been deregulated over 2 decades ago. Large swaths of the West and the Southeast have maintained their independence, refusing to join a regional grid or state grid. It didn't help that at the time, the Western US entered into an energy crisis in 2000 and 2001 as some energy companies like Enron manipulated the market and contributed to shortages, which hit consumers with a series of blackouts and soaring costs. Flash forward, energy efficiency, the shale gas boom, and solar and wind generation helped reduce wholesale power costs and offset the increases in costs from transmission. This is all changing now. But at the time, California was a leader and still is in wind and solar and clean energy development. And a decade ago, it started the energy imbalance market to trade real-time power with neighboring Western entities to help integrate more renewables. And in 2026, they will expand that into a day-ahead market to trade more power ahead of time to plan better. But now looking at, and the California Independent System Operator has said that these have been stepping stones to potentially a more integrated grid. Does it make sense now? And today on this panel, we're going to discuss the merits of that. Does it make sense for consumers? We have Michelle Beck, Director of the Utah Office of Consumer Services, Todd Myers, Vice President of Research at the Washington Policy Center, Josh Smith, Energy Policy Lead at the Abundance Institute, and Michael Giberson, Senior Fellow of Energy at R Street. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much. We're expecting a lively debate. I'm going to ask each of you to give like a very brief introduction to set the scene so people know the kind of work you're doing and where you're coming from. Why don't we start with you, Michelle?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'd like to start by noting that the Utah Office of Consumer Services, we are the consumer advocate in Utah for residential and small commercial customers of public utilities. And I am here today presenting my own views. I am not representing the state of Utah or my particular office, although you will see our office take similar positions in many regards. So I've been I've had the privilege to be in this position and serving the customers of Utah for almost 18 years now. And I put a lot of my efforts currently into regionalization. I was on the most recent version of the Governance Review Committee of the Western Energy Markets. I am a sector liaison on the launch committee for the Pathways Initiative that was mentioned in Michael's paper. I host a monthly meeting of other consumer advocates. But even maybe more importantly than that, earlier in my career, 20 years ago, or maybe more than 20 years ago now, I worked in the Midwest, and I worked in a large G&T cooperative at the time that we were making the decision of whether or not to join the MISO. So I feel like I bring that experience of evaluation, albeit from a different perspective, and then a lot of current focus on these issues. And thank you again for having me.
Todd?
Thank you. I'm Todd Myers. I'm the Vice President for Research at the Washington Policy Center. We are a market-oriented think tank in Washington State, and I've worked on energy and environment policy for almost a quarter of a century. Washington has been blessed for that time with a lot of abundant hydro. Hydro is very inexpensive and very flexible. So Washington consistently has some of the lowest energy rates in the country. The Pacific Northwest generally has benefited from that because hydro is so flexible, it can meet the peak demands and other things like that. But things are changing, obviously. Washington has enacted a number of rules about the future of energy and where that should come from, primarily intermittent renewables. The same thing is happening in Oregon. So how we deal with that is a big question. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which looks at energy supply into the future and makes sure that there is resource adequacy, notes that in the future there could be problems. and that we will have shortages, and how we deal with those shortages and how we deal with the rest of the West, I think, is a big question. The problem is not getting better, it's getting worse. And we're, behind the curve in a lot of ways. So the role that an RTO can play in making sure that we have resource adequacy and that prices remain low, I think, is a really interesting one. And it's why I'm really happy to be part of this conversation.
And Josh?
Thanks for having me. My name is Josh Smith. I'm the Energy Policy Lead at the Abundance Institute. I'm based in Logan, Utah. It's a beautiful place, and I'm excited to join, as Mike has been a friend and colleague for years. I know Todd as well, and I'm excited that Michelle's joining so that we have a stacked Utah panel as well. But I think, to echo Todd's comments, a lot of the concerns around energy are about, do we have enough? Can we do it cleanly? And the Abundance Institute is really interested in making a very simple point, which is that prosperity is energy intensive. There's a very common graphic that shows the energy use and welfare, human welfare, kind of rising together. And that's the story that we like to pitch in all of the work that we do. How do we find and exploit new resources? The story of humanity really is one about rising out of a world where during the Stone Age, all we can do is pick up rocks and throw them at each other. We get slightly better at that when we start being able to enter the Iron Age and Bronze Age, when we can build tools that are only possible because of our agency and control over energy. So really excited to be here and represent kind of the Institute's work broadly, and then my kind of point of view on energy policy. Thanks again.
And finally, Michael.
Hi, and again, welcome to all of you. I'm glad that we have this panel come together to talk about this. So I'm Michael Giberson, Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute in Energy Policy, where I work on some free market energy policy. R Street is a free market think tank in DC, with a decidedly pragmatist bent. I guess that maybe sets us up a little bit, that we're some of our think tank brethren are more philosophical, or they engage in different ways, but we're very much happy to get into the weeds and try to sort things out, try to help steer conversations, policy conversations our way. And so in the energy teams, we've been fans of electric power markets, both at wholesale and retail level. We note that some work better than others. Some have worked better. Things, there are ways to do them well and worse. And so we joined this conversation trying to ensure that when public policy decisions are being made, that we sort of get the best out. We can get the best out of them. And so that's both sort of our overall outlook and the outlook I took to the report that I wrote that became then the sort of the, not necessarily the only thing we're going to talk about, but a contribution to this conversation about RTO developments in the West.
Well, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit about your report and kind of like what the highlights are to set the stage?
Yeah, sure. So published by the R Street Institute a week ago, and I probably shared that link in the chat if you haven't seen the report, but we'll make sure that link is available to you. The primary goal of the report is to sort of introduce people to what's going on. So as Noreen mentioned in the introduction, there have been power markets developing in the West over the last 10 years, sort of formal power markets developing in the West over the last 10 years or so. There's been energy trading in the Western United States for decades. That is, sort of utility to utility trading and other kinds of power plants trading with utilities and so on. About 10 years ago, the Western Energy Imbalance Market got launched, where it's a little bit more integrated, a little bit more coordinated, more direct coordination. But a lot of talk has been going on since then. It's whether the Western region, whether it should develop a full-scale RTO, a regional transmission organization, which forms around, as its core, has this power market, but really sort of brings a power market into operation with the operation of the transmission grid. That is both coordinating the purchase and sale of power, matching that with the capacity of the transmission grid so that sort of get the most use out of that transmission grid without overloading any particular part of it, right? And so I'm not an engineer, I'm an economist, but so I know only a little bit about the engineering side of things. We can think of the vast grid, a bunch of wires, transmission wires that connect big power plants and consumers all around the Western United States. Each of those power lines has a certain capacity, a certain capability, and every time anyone in the West is using some part of the grid, it affects power flows everywhere else on the grid. And that's kind of the big challenge that RTOs are designed to address, is to help coordinate those power flows so that we can use as much of that grid as possible to get low-cost power to consumers before we have to resort to the higher-cost power, when that's all that's left. The more we can get out of the grid, the more we can use that low-cost power wherever it is. So the report tries to do a couple things. First, it explains very basically what an RTO is. It's kind of an air traffic controller for the grid. It doesn't own power plants or transmission grids. It just coordinates, and it uses a market to help coordinate so that we can find the cheapest power available. And then after that introduction, it gives a little bit of background about what's been going on in the West. There are lots of different, Michelle used the word regionalization. So there are lots of regionalization efforts going on right now. The possible development of an RTO is just one of many different things going on in the West. So there's a lot to keep track of. The report gives a very brief overview of some of these things that are going on. Part of the point of the report is just to bring to allow a reader sort of to get the speed kind of on what's going on, at least get familiar with the ground a little bit, and then be a little bit better informed so you can become engaged in the debate. You can understand some of the things that are going on. As these discussions develop, and particularly if an RTO is to be formed, many states will have regulations or state laws that will have to be changed to allow utilities to participate in regional organization. When those decisions are going to be made, it's not just going to be industry, the people, the regulators that are devoted to the industry, or the utilities themselves, or the consumer advocates involved, but there's not the whole state legislature is going to have to get involved, perhaps, and so a wider range of people are going to have to be up to speed on what's going on. The report tries to sort of open up the discussion to a broader audience.
Great. So Michelle, there's been a lot of skepticism over the last decade or so about whether this is a good path, and also past initiatives have not quite taken off. Is this effort different this time? And if you could talk about the effort, because there is sort of a competition in the West, of the California grid trying to win over new utilities or balancing authorities, and then there's the Southwest Power Pool who's kind of ahead. And is this do you think this is real?
Right. And I do think there's a lot of real progress being made. I might dispute the idea that the Southwest Power Pool is ahead in terms of how things are actually unfolding, where things are in their current level of approval, and those utilities who have indicated their preferences. But nonetheless, they're both still very much in play. And it's hard for me to articulate why it's different this time, because it has to be at least the third major sort of push towards regionalization in the last 10 years. But it does truly feel different to me this time. And I think part of it could be the fact that there are two entities that are making proposals, and it's creating a little bit of competition, maybe, and not just competition for participants, but competition of ideas. So if one can come in and say, hey, we've heard that this that maybe governance is an issue, and ours is different from that perspective, and then vice versa. We've heard concerns about, issue B in your proposal, and we're doing that different. So I like this idea of competition of ideas, because I do think that some of the earlier efforts were hindered by at least a viewpoint that it was, and they really did center in CAISO. So I don't mean to malign CAISO in any way. They were the entity at play. And I think there was too much perception that this was California trying to export its policy. And now I think that the perception has really changed, so that now it's more of a respond to the marketplace. What are stakeholders looking for? What are utilities looking for? How do we build up institutions and organizations, maybe differently than they formed in the East, but to advance the public interest, as well as advance some of the ideas that Michael explained so well, this idea of more efficient dispatch and other potential benefits that an RTO can bring. So that's what I see as being different, although it's one of those things hard to put your finger on exactly.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because this feels like a much more polarized time politically, and we're heading into elections next week. Early voting has started, but like the idea of like what the energy mix is, and also like the climate shocks we've seen, like has, caused like some areas to like extend the life of coal plants or build, and there's a debate of like maybe having the biggest gas plant build out in years, if not ever, coming up with it for this AI data boom. So like the conversation away from fossil fuels and ESG has like shifted back. How do you like, but California has like still pushed ahead. How do you like create an RTO that like takes into account all of these like different perspectives and objectives?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of polarization in these issues as well, but they may split down different dividing lines. But in my opinion, I'm knee deep in this work right now, so certainly I carry a bias. But I do think that the Pathways Initiative, which was also referred to as WWGPI, West-Wide Governance Pathways Initiative, but we now kind of fondly call it Pathways. And I do think that it's showing a focus. It's clearly articulated a focus on public interest and on respecting and honoring the differences of public policy in different states. So that issue has been elevated. Now, there are competing proposals out there, so we don't know where things land yet, but it is nice to have those issues elevated, because I think that gives us a platform to potentially work together, whereas before, with these political differences, I think that was very challenging.
And Todd, you've been outspoken about just, states like going down the wrong pathway, like with incentives, and like what I'm thinking about, like a piece you wrote about solar not too long ago. But how do you view this? Like, how do you bring that together without like being overburdensome to consumers and making sure there's an economic benefit?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with an RTO, and somebody mentioned, California using this to export its policy. And I think that's a major concern of people I talk to on the center right, like me, which is that these sort of markets either export those bad policies by raising costs. We've already seen this. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council and other folks talk about the duck curve moving north. And so we are starting to see, when California has shortages, we're already starting to see prices. And there's a concern that that an RTO makes that more likely. The other issue is that California, because it's so big, or other states within the region, including Washington, by having a high cost energy policy and less reliable sources of energy, puts those burdens on other states. But I think that there's also some other aspects, which is that states like Idaho and others who don't have those policies can benefit. We're seeing this right now with Amazon, right? Amazon is recognizing that they need reliable sources of energy for their data centers, So they are pushing very hard into nuclear and modular nuclear. States like Idaho and others could do the same thing, where their policy allows more flexibility to address reliability issues and keep prices low. And then they can provide California, Washington, others with more restrictive requirements about, allowable sources of energy like renewables and sell it to them. So, Idaho could, build new nuclear, new natural gas and things and sources like that. And then sell the renewables to everybody else. So they benefit. They can find a way to keep their costs low and sell higher cost electricity to other states. So, I think that the key is transparency and flexibility, which provides those sorts of incentives, which can counteract a concern that I don't think is unreasonable, that states like Washington, California, and others can end up imposing some of those costs. But we're already seeing that to some extent, and RTO is not going to be the thing that causes that to happen. We've already seen that. I think an RTO is a way to help deal with that problem that already exists.
Josh or Michael?
I want to echo what Todd said, and maybe with a simpler example, which is very, imagine you paid $1,500 for a sandwich, and then you ate it, and you said, that's not bad, right? This is what Andy George did when he did he grew his own vegetables for a sandwich. He killed his own chicken. He flew on a plane to collect seawater with salt, then turn that seawater into the salt to use in his actual baking. So he did all the steps in between. It ends up costing $1,500, and it's not very good. And that's kind of the story of a lot of these big initiatives that we want to do together. Makes sense because there's so much that you can gain if you are working together. If people can specialize and trade amongst themselves, you end up with good sandwiches for $5 instead of $1,500 sandwiches. But I think Todd's right. The big constraints or big worries people will have about an RTO proposal are always going to be, do I have to pay for California's bad policies? So finding ways to assure customers that they won't have to, assure the state legislators and the PUCs that they won't have to, is going to be an important part of this. But I think Mike's paper does a good job laying out, well, there's a lot of market opportunities here for you guys to sell power into these markets just the same.
I think that it just occurred to me, this question about whether California is going to cause everyone else's power prices to go up. This comes up frequently in the sort of discussions, because you look at California electric utility rates, and people are paying 30 or 40 cents a kilowatt hour. And in Utah or Arizona, where I used to live, prices are 12 cents, I think 12, 13 cents on average. It's like, if I'm paying 13 cents and I'm looking across the border in California and they're paying, 35 or 40 cents, I don't want that. Well, the good news, Todd, and everyone else not in California, good news for everyone not in California, is most of that is the retail price, not the wholesale price, right? The wholesale prices are not particularly high in California. It's just that the state of California, in its energy policy wisdom, has layered on a lot of costs to pursue other energy policy goals. And there are additional costs of doing business in California, just again, for state policy reasons, and maybe for absolutely wonderful state policy reasons. Right? I don't want to, I haven't been in the California policymaking trenches. I don't know why they came to the decisions they have, but for the most part, these are the difference between the retail price in California and the wholesale price in California. We're talking about wholesale prices, wholesale markets, wholesale power markets. And so wholesale power prices are not way out of line in California. And so, maybe those other policies in California have some effect on their neighbors, but it's not nearly as stark as it looked like if you just compare retail prices, right? So that's the good news, again, unless you're in California, where you've got to, figure out how you're going to pursue all these energy policy goals and keep prices down so that people can electrify. You know, it's a from the outside it seems a little crazy, but again, you know, California's its own kind of place.
Maureen, I wonder if you'd let me respond to one thing that was just raised a minute ago. We heard a little bit about the Idaho, your hypothetical Idaho example of building nuclear or gas, whatever they want, and then selling renewables. I think that actually that articulates another fear that some of us, I think some of the us in this subregion of, I'll call the Intermountain West, have, and that is, will we be properly compensated for what we bring to the market? Because if we're the ones building the reliable, dispatchable resources and just selling renewables into the market, and other states only are interested in purchasing our renewables, then the question is raised of, are you leaning on us for that reliability? And are the dispatchable resources being properly compensated for all of the value that they bring? Because there's a lot of reliability benefits. And I'm certainly not here suggesting that we need all dispatchable resources, but this idea of proper compensation is a very real concern, and one that would need to be addressed in the market design. Because just even hearing you describe it makes me think we're less aligned than initially I thought.
I think that this is an important problem actually in other RTOs as well. You know, there's been a big change in the electric power industry as a whole over the last 25 or 30 years. Most of the RTOs in the Eastern United States became formed either in the late 1990s or early 2000s, and you know, and they launched on a big base of, you know, sort of thermal power plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, hydropower as well. Was you know, sort of the bulk of nuclear power plants. That was pretty much, you know, 80, 90, 100% of the grid for those regions when they launched their markets. And you know, when you're talking about, whether you're talking about nuclear power plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, or hydropower, these are all big sort of spinning thermal masses. They have inertia, a property, you know, it's kind of a bit of physics that works in support of the grid. It helps stabilize little fluctuations and stuff. And, you know, and that sort of came along for free when they didn't have to think about that when they designed these markets in the first place. The reliability benefits that came from inertia and from other sorts of things that were just inherent in the system as they saw it. They didn't have to solve the problem because there was no problem to be solved yet. We find as you add solar power, as you add wind power, they don't have these same characteristics. We discover that, oh, you might have to pay attention to how much inertia on the system. Now, I don't think any power system, any regional system in the US is currently sort of in danger of not having enough inertia on the system. But we're moving into an area where engineers are saying, hey, we got to keep an eye on that. Now it turns out there are ways, if you don't have actual thermal, you know, actual mass spinning in a turbine, you can do it synthetically, you know, electronically. You know, there are ways of solving the problem, but you know, it's one of these problems that wasn't a problem 25 years ago. It's become, you know, we've become aware, you know, grid watchers have become aware that it can become a problem. And so now they're sort of, you know, thinking both about how to solve it as a technical issue, but then how do you solve it efficiently, you know, in a market-friendly way, or at least in a way that doesn't undermine the market parts of the system. Because, you know, we like the market parts of the system. You know, this is an area of debate in the industry as well. Some thinking that we don't really need markets, or we're better off without markets. We just need utilities to do planning, or we need regulators to oversee the utilities doing the planning, and then everything is kind of copacetic. Others, fans of the market, for generally keeping costs down and promoting innovation, some other things like that. We'd like to see more markets because we think we need more innovation in the electric power industry. We need to solve new problems faster in the electric power industry, and the regulated utility style that dominated the last century was really good at some things. It was really good at keeping power costs down for a long time anyway. It was really good at building out a system, but it's not so good at innovation. It just got, it got bigger, economies of scale helped keep costs down. But now, in a time of faster change, right? We're talking now after decades of relatively flat electric load in the country. Now we see an increasing demand for power, concern or the promise of AI is suggesting that we're going to need to build a lot more power plants. People who want to electrify transportation, but we're going to have to build more power plants to generate the power to serve. We're going to have to build more power plants. We have to do new things. We want to do them fast. We want to keep costs down. We want to keep it clean. There's lots of things, lots of problems to solve, a lot of issues to solve, and we want to solve those problems faster. In general, markets seem to promote solving problems faster. So we like the markets. We want to keep costs down. We want to solve problems faster. But we're also working together, across political boundaries. There's a irreducible political element in a system, and so there's a lot of public policy. We're going to do that well, but we want it to, we want the public policy stuff to do the public policy side well. Well, we let the markets and businesses do the business side well. And so
when you're looking, sorry. So when you raise some really good points, because like when you're looking at the market, like every market in the US is struggling with trying to figure out how do you ensure the right type of generation comes online and back up. You have like resource adequacy in California. You have like PJM's capacity auction that kind of gets reviewed every year and delayed. And then you have like the Texas Energy Fund trying to use taxpayer money in a free market state to like build gas generation. Is there a way, like, do you see a model out there? And maybe it's like a Frankenstein model of different grids or practices to like solve this problem, and you can do it fresh in the West, maybe. I don't know, Todd, you're the markets expert. Like, what do you think is like a good way or a good path, or what are you looking for?
I think that's a very difficult question, but I think you're right. I mean, nothing is ever as simple as you make it. And of course, as Michelle pointed out, the challenge is that when you try to, you create a market and you overlay that market over a bunch of a patchwork of political approaches, and that creates those distortions. So I certainly understand the concern about reliable resources, dispatchable power being valued appropriately. I can tell you that in recent years, we have seen the value of dispatchable hydro go up for that very reason. So there was a debate in Washington State about removing 4 dams that we have on the lower Snake River. The argument for many years was that those dams were not producing enough, generating enough revenue to pay for themselves, that they were relying on subsidies and other things like that. That argument has not been made in recent years because they are dispatchable, because the value of that electricity and of the dispatchability of that power has gone up. So the market, the existing market, has recognized that. So it is hard to predict how these things will sort out. Let me give you one other. I'm sort of talking around your question, or not intentionally, but simply because it is often hard to predict exactly how this will shake out. Let me give you one more example. I have a paper coming out upcoming about the future of hydropower in the United States, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest under climate change, what will happen. And one of the things is that when you have less water available, when you have more intermittent sources of power, the water that is behind those dams becomes more, it's like they're a giant battery, it becomes more valuable. And so what is predicted is that how we manage those dams will change. Right now, they are a consistent source of energy, but they will be moved more to peaking power. And so to Michelle's point, right, what's happening is you're seeing the value of that flexibility go up. Everybody will have a fight about what the proper value of dispatchability and that flexibility will be. But people are already talking, people who manage those dams, like the Army Corps and Bonneville Power, who sells it, are already thinking ahead to, if we have to deal with more intermittency in the future, we're going to have to change the way that we manage these dams. And RTO can help with that by making it flexibility so that you can use those dams in a way that is most efficient, rather than having to hold resources back in case there is a problem, in case there's very high demand. And so it sort of smooths those things out. That may make it look like that dispatchability is not being valued, but the dispatchability and the flexibility doesn't go away. It just means that relatively in a larger market, it's not as valuable as it would be in a more fragmented market.
And while an RTO might be able to take care of this resource adequacy problem, I'm not convinced that there's a proper market solution. I don't think we can look to any of the existing RTOs and say, wow, look what they're doing. They've nailed resource adequacy. So I'm going to be one vote on the Frankenstein option and say, I think we got a little behind the issue, but I'm very optimistic about the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which we fondly call WRAP, W-R-A-P, that was mentioned in Michael's paper, because I think that a solely a market solution is not going to have the foresight to see these needs, especially with the long. It doesn't show up in the market prices, in my experience, soon enough to allow for the long lead time to build those resources. And so I think it's going to always have to be coupled with requirements, and at least with the WRAP requirements, they're voluntary. This is an effort of utilities coming together and agreeing we have to work on these problems together. And wouldn't it have been great if we had gotten that started 5 years earlier? I think maybe we would be in a little less capacity constrained situation right now, but I am optimistic of how that might play into the other developments in the West.
I want to say I don't disagree with what you're saying. It will be Frankenstein one way or the other. The less we can make it look like Boris Karloff, the better.
And Josh, we've been talking about like how to value generation and capacity markets, but I think you don't really like capacity markets, right? Can you tell us like what your vision is?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Noreen. I've been preaching this to everyone who will listen. Most of the problems you are worried about are a problem of capacity markets and the administrative decisions they must include instead of letting a market system operate. There are definitely market failures. So what I'd really like would be the energy only system out of Texas and applying it into other areas. So that's the one that I would suggest in our Frankenstein. That's the big picture that I would want. Whatever limb, choose your favorite limb. That's the piece I want to graft onto the Frankenstein we're talking about for the West. But the reason it works well is because we actually price in with the value of the load that might be lost in a blackout. And then we can add in that value to prices to signal when generators should be online, that there's money to be made here if they think far in advance. And those are the decentralized decision making that we should want instead of centralizing it in either something like the Texas Energy Fund. Texas isn't perfect, right? We still have this public subsidy of the energy system at the state level, not to mention the billions spent at the federal level for specific favored energy sources. So the reason you should like the Texas system is it produces instead of one decision maker, instead of someone at the utility, someone at the PUC, someone in the state legislature making the decision for everyone, everybody gets incentivized to get involved. So there's not just the big gas generators that we could build and add in Texas. There's also David Energy is a company that will work with your home battery to sell power at really valuable times. So you, as the consumer, can be involved at every level, at the grid edge, as we usually talk about it. So the kind of innovation that Mike mentioned is best found in market systems. And so if you want consumers to not just have a reason to put rooftop solar on their house, but to have the incentive to adopt a whole suite, a whole stack of energy technologies, then you want some kind of price signal that is as least kind of disturbed or screwed up by the well-meaning but not well-informed always regulators at hand. So I think that's the real promise in the Texas system, is some kind of very clear market signal that suggests to everyone, not just the big generators, but to every individual, here's how you can help and aid in the system staying balanced.
I'm just going to push back a little bit because I've been like tuning into the ERCOT hearings, the Texas State Grid. And, you know, for the last couple of years, you've had like the independent market monitor say, well, these generators are reaping in record profits, but no one's building. And now the Texas Energy Fund will like maybe support 10,000 megawatts, but they need 60,000 megawatts. There are a lot of merits to that system, but they are also like talking about capacity for the first time. It didn't like, who knows if it'll have legs in the end, the performance credit mechanism, but to hear Texas talk about capacity in a way that's not a curse word is a new thing. So how do you do both? Like, is it that we just have to stop thinking about the old way of doing things? Like you're talking about bringing in consumers, like how do you incentivize that there's enough like backup generation or existing generation doesn't get shut down that you'll need for 20, 30 more years? And like, yeah, there still seems to be a missing money problem.
I think there's definitely missing money in the reliability question overall, but that's why you add in, as Michelle suggested, you have some kind of requirement. My position and the kind of like economic point of view in my mind is that you want to do that as the kind of like side dish, not your main course. And the problem in capacity markets and give you two different meals. It's like sitting down at a restaurant and getting an Indian like curry alongside your like white sauce pizza. It's like a very strange mix that's probably a good fit for someone, but the right idea should be instead, okay, let's have a market system, have your main dish be whatever you want to order, and then have a side dish of something smaller, which is like this insurance program you might buy. In Texas, what I really like is the operating demand reserve curve, or operating reserves demand. And I think that is a better way to do it because you can say, here's what the value is of what we might lose if we have a blackout. You can add that value into prices to signal to people, here are really valuable times. And the big generators can capture it. You could capture it as a consumer. And instead of having one solution dictated, we get 1,000 flowers that bloom.
Can you design a regional grid around that? Or do you think we'll see multiple grids emerge in the West? And is a grid inevitable, like a competitive power market, RTO?
Well, I mean, there is sort of one grid in the West, right? One interconnected grid in the Western interconnection, actually extending into Canada and a bit into Mexico. But you know, are we? But we have it. Will we have one RTO that serves the entire West, at least Western United States, or not? I mean, this has been, you know, one of the key issues that the West has tried to grapple with is, you know, is the California ISO market going to expand to become a West-wide ISO market, or is there going to be California doing its California thing and the rest of the West or much of the rest of the West in something else? I think that either approach is possible. That is, so the Pathways Initiative is trying to sort of leverage the experience and capabilities of the California ISO, sort of leverage it to the West by finding a way to move it out from under strictly California political oversight, right? Because the rest of the West, if there's going to be a West-wide market, wants to be part of the oversight of the market, right? And not have it exclusively California dominated, which the California ISO is. So the Pathways Institute Pathways Initiative is working sort of to try to get the benefit of all that experience and all that expertise for the rest of the West. Again, under an appropriate political superstructure, government, a West-wide board rather than a California-specific board.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, so I think that's one way that things. There's lots of benefits for having one market serve the whole region, because if you have two markets or more serving the region, then there's always some friction involved in trading across between the markets, right? Because you got to comply with one market's rules, but you also have to be cognizant of the other market, and there's costs involved, and there may be different trading deadlines or all sorts of little rule differences that just interfere with sort of the completely sort of free flow of power back and forth. In the commercial flow of power, although again, because of the physics of the grid, the power is going to flow where the power is going to flow anyway. Mostly, what the RTO does is make the market aware of that, and then people can respond in market ways, in ways that are again coordinated with the grid. But if we end up with two markets, it's not it's not the end of the world. And some people seem to think we have to have one market or nothing. Well, and I think that two markets is also a respectable possibility. The technology, I mean, it's easy to look to the east and all the RTOs there, and the trouble they have trading and all the time they devote to trying to solve seams problems, and think, well, why build two markets in the west with a seam and then basically commit ourselves to a future of forever dealing with seams problems if we can avoid it. I think that that's a good reason to try to work hard for this one market, but ultimately I'd rather have two markets in 2030 instead of one market in 2050, right? And if the one market approach is not going to work anytime soon, let's go ahead and get those benefits that are available from RTO outside of California. And then we can worry about coordination. Then we can worry about maybe some future, grand unification, if that makes sense later. But the technology of coordinating power flows across seams is so much better now than it was 25. We can sort of build in better solutions at the start and at least avoid some of the problems that has been experienced in the West. I mean, in the East, right? And
do you agree, Michelle?
Well, I don't think that seams issues are driving how markets are developing. And there's a part of me that feels a little offended that certain policymakers or those who kind of focus on the more theoretical want to impose that on the West when nobody imposed that on the East. But I think we need to remember that things really are developing differently. Things are developing incrementally. There are different views in different sub-regions of the West, and just a few items just for additional thought. One, it's hard for me to imagine, and I'm not a betting person, so I'm not going to say what I think will or will not happen, but it's hard to imagine a result where there's California and all the rest of the West. That's not how interests align. And so that I don't see happening. It's also impossible for me to imagine that that the entire West will be in any form of an RTO by 2030. That's also not how things are happening. We've been somewhat interchanging markets and RTOs in our discussion here, but we do need to be clear, and certainly Michael's paper is clear about this, that there are markets, and then there are a lot of other things that layer on before you get to an RTO. And that I just think there are a lot of folks, a lot of corners of the West who are not convinced of an RTO. An RTO requires a higher level of you have to turn over authority of your the utilities facilities. That requires a different level of approval, whereas these markets are developing without the same level of approval. And I think that folks are a little unconvinced of the incremental benefits of a full RTO as compared to the costs and the different authorities that are going to come out of that. Now, there are also parts of the West who are uninterested in stopping at an energy market and really are incredibly driven towards a full RTO. So those are some of the tensions that are out there as well.
And I think, Josh, you had an op-ed, I think last week, talking about how Utah is pursuing a policy to double its energy capacity. And it made me think, like, I think it was the governor that announced Operation Gigawatt. Is an RTO and the complexities you mentioned that come with it too much to layer on top of these other goals? Like, is there too much going on? And is this actually going to be something like more of a 2050 goal, like to get through all of the complications?
I'd love to see more integration before 2050. I think that's an easy answer on my side. Whether or not that looks exactly like an RTO or market level reforms instead, harder to say, I guess. But yes, I think Governor Cox's vision for Utah is power is fundamental, prosperity is energy intensive. And so how do we create a Utah with lots of energy resources? Now, Utah with double the capacity can do all sorts of things. The piece that Chris Koopman and I wrote for the Deseret News is mostly about, look, there are environmental reasons to do this too. We can desalinate water and use it for agriculture. We can pull in water and refill the Great Salt Lake. Whatever crazy science fiction sounding ideas are possible when you start removing energy as this constraint. But I think that the fundamental reason that you might want to double your capacity is something Mike's paper does really well, which is, yeah, if other places are getting rid of all of their backup supply that they can turn on when they need it most, that gives Utah effectively a monopoly on saying, oh, California is in danger of blacking out. We can flip on our generators and earn a lot of money during these moments in the market. And that's why price signals matter so much, is we can encourage a lot of development, encourage a lot of innovation if we let people watch kind of the price signals. I think for most people, prices are the villain, right? They're the Pixar villain that's really terrible and has stolen all of the woodland creatures that you have to rescue, whatever the plot of the movie is, right? Economists have to beat the door down of every house and make the case instead that prices are the hero. They're the ones that help you see the light, that help you guide towards innovative ideas, guide you towards the kinds of solutions that consumers actually need. So what is a high electricity price signal? In the wholesale markets, it's signaling this is a really valuable time to generate right now. And so I think there's a lot of value here in thinking about, what do we do with electricity resources that we would double in the state of Utah? A lot of it's going to be helping out everyone around us, in addition to doing all sorts of wondrous things here at home.
And Todd, like historically, I think the Pacific Northwest, you kind of alluded to it, has plentiful hydro resources and was the discount market for electricity. But more recently, it's become the premium market at times, like in summer. Looking at the futures curve, what happens in reality is different. But is that changing behavior or doing anything?
I think it's
and does that create an
hard to
incentive?
know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. And one aspect of this that I think Michelle is hitting on that needs to be addressed, which is that there are some issues that no system, RTO or otherwise, can address. So one of the things that we're looking at in the future in the Pacific Northwest is that there may be a smaller chance of big blackouts, but many more frequent smaller blackouts. Now, that how you manage those two, right, is not just a market. It's not a question of just the market or things like that, right? There are some of these issues which are choices, which are political choices, which is risk management and what risks you take more seriously that are beyond simply saying we're going to create, transparent markets or an RTO. I mean, those decisions are sort of the details that make people nervous that I think Michelle is raising, because they are independent somewhat of the particular system, and they have to be dealt with one way or the other. So I think I don't want to, I don't want to imply that I'm overlooking those. I'm certainly not. And those, like I said, there's going to be a Frankenstein, and those are the kinds of decisions that each state will make differently and put different priorities on, and have to be accommodated in whatever system there is.
I have to throw out this factoid because speaking to that, the Western Interconnection, like on the WEC website, says that they initiated 24 emergency action alerts this year in the first 7 months, and 14 of them were level 3 emergencies, which is the closest you get to load shedding. They didn't actually have load shedding, but that's higher than all the events last year. So that speaks to what you're saying, that the stress is growing. So Michelle, like, how would you respond to that? And then also, like, what would it take for you to be convinced that an RTO is the right, it's the right time to go down that path, especially since Utah is interesting because Pacificor and Berkshire Hathaway play such a big role. They're the dominant utility there, and they have been a driver behind like these smaller market develop, smaller quote unquote than an RTO, which is the EIM and now the day ahead market.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm definitely going to be supporting an incremental approach. And I think that we need to be just being cautious against the pitfalls that we've seen in the East and building something from a little bit from scratch. I mean, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel. There are systems out there that we can import into what we're doing, but we need to be looking at those gaps in other places. And so I just know that for the recommendations I'll be making here in my state, we'll be looking at those incremental costs, incremental benefits. And so to me, it looks different in a market, in an energy market, than it looks when you're putting in your transmission. There's a lot of new issues that come in. And I know folks who are very excited for an RTO because it will solve the transmission planning process and we will see new transmission built. My response to that is always like, okay, well, where did that happen in the East? These markets have been in place for decades. And I know that there are a lot of cost and oversight implications that my colleagues there are concerned about. So to me, I couldn't possibly say today we should join an RTO. There's nothing that would convince me of that. But I've been doing this for 30 years, and the thing that's constant is change. And so I know that it's going to look different, and not in 10 years, not in 5 years. It's going to look different in 2 or 3 years. So I think this kind of constant evaluation of things and trying to create systems that are a little bit more flexible and like Michael said earlier, maybe that can respond more quickly as well. So I'm on board for that kind of constant creative thinking and what's next and how do we evolve. But I'm endorsing that we should evolve differently.
And then just to round out the panel, we have a couple of minutes left just to play off of that. We have an attendee question. How can we ensure that RTO benefits are passed on to end use consumers rather than intercepted by savvy market participants and transmission owners? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. I think that, so mostly that's a question of retail power policy. And so so in our current situation, it's in the West, it's mostly going to be an issue of state regulator oversight and consumer advocate oversight of rate-making processes, just making sure that, you know, as the wholesale market drives efficiency and lowers costs, that those cost savings do get passed through in regulated rates that retail customers are paying in the West. I mean, I think we see fairly clear evidence in Texas that we've had an active competitive retail market, that savings at the wholesale level got passed through to retail customers in Texas. It's a little less clear elsewhere. They have a little bit different retail choice situations, and many places don't have retail choice. It's all regulated. And so mostly that's, you know, check up with your retail state regulations and make sure that, you know, cost savings get passed along. There is a little bit more. There's also a question about whether electric utilities, transmission owners are taking advantage of opportunities. This takes us a little bit far afield, but there's some concern in many states that transmission owners are taking advantage of sort of a regulatory gap in oversight to boost their investment in transmission in ways that help that raise rates on the transmission side. I think we see over the last 10 or 15 years that the energy cost part of a consumer's bill has been relatively level or going down, but the transmission and distribution cost part of the bill is going higher and higher. And that's the regulated part of the bill that's going higher and higher. The market part of the bill is flat to lower in most states, kind of on average. Every state's a little bit different story, but that's sort of the big picture. So again, check with the regulators, make sure they're not letting utilities sort of gold plate their systems or overbuild in order to boost their regulated rates of return.
I know we're at the top of the hour, but I really can't let that go unchallenged, because there are a lot of regulatory agencies and almost all the consumer advocates and in the West who are under-resourced. And this is an unfair burden to put on our part of the sector. And so I think if we want to help to make sure that the benefits flow to customers, part of that is correct design. Part of that is making sure we have independent market monitors that are listened to, that are allowed to really surface these issues, because under-resourced state agencies are not going to be your only solution.
And Todd and Josh, you have any quick last thoughts? Sorry, just try to wrap it up. Great. Did you have anything quick, Michael? Or
No, we should wrap up at the end of the hour and let people take their time.
Great. Thank you all for joining. This was the R Street panel and RTO for the West. What's in it for consumers? As you can tell, the debate is still raging, so stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.